friends, welcome to the Econista. I'm so glad you're here. Today is our first of the topics related to the affordability series, so I'm actually going to go in depth on different items and why they have become so unaffordable to everyday US consumers. Today's topic is housing. So we're kicking it off with a bang. Before I go into the actual video, I want to give you a little bit of background on me, which will make sense once you see how I organize this video. So I actually grew up doing theater. I did theater for like 10 years. I was a theater and economics double major for a year or two in college, which led to the hilarious question, so what are you going to be when you graduate? A theater economist? To which I would respond, I would love to be a theater economist. If anyone needs a theater economist, let me know. You have your girl. Anyway, all that to say, the video today is going to be a little bit more theatrical than my videos in the past. And when I think about housing, the first thing that comes to my mind is just who done it, Who is to blame for the situation we are in today? So this episode is going to be a whodunit. We're going to figure out who we need to convict for the criminally high price of housing in the US right now. So before we get into our suspects in the case of the criminally high US housing costs, I want to lay out the details of the crime because I feel like everyone sort of knows that housing is expensive, or really knows if you have been out there looking for housing recently. Totally not speaking from experience or anything like that. But if you've been out of the market, maybe you own your home or you're like in a rent-controlled apartment, maybe you don't really know what all the fuss is about. So I'm going to lay it out. And if you are someone who knows, this might be useful just so you have a couple facts in your back pocket for when someone inevitably tries to tell you that it's not that bad out there. I'm a millennial. We were told we were just eating too much avocado toast. I don't think that's what did it. So let's get into the facts. Since June of 2020, home prices are up 49% in 6 years. 49%. That is just crazy to me. The median price of a home is now over $440,000. And the chart I'm going to show you next lays out exactly how bad the situation is because it looks at the cost of housing compared to incomes. So you can really see just how much everyday consumers are getting squeezed. This graph shows the median home price in the US compared to the median income. So this black line here has the overall ratio for the US, and then these different colored bars here show the ratio for the top 100 metros. And so the colors align with this legend at the bottom. So this dark blue is under 3x. That's really what we want to be aiming for because guidelines say you should spend 30% or less of your income on housing. And it progressively gets more and more expensive, ending with this 5x red color here. And then you can see on the right side how the ratio stacks up overall. So what I think you can see pretty clearly in this chart is in the 1990s to 2000, the ratio is about 3.2x overall, and most of the top metros were at 3x or below. There are some that are in that 3 to 3.9x, but very few places are you looking above 4x. Then gradually it increases, peaking in 2005 here, and then it falls back down again. But what I think is most notable is looking at the past few years. So if we look here at 2019, the ratio is at 4.2x. But now in 2024, we have actually hit 5x. So in the span of 5 years, that's a pretty significant increase. And you can really see it in the color coding. There used to be a decent amount of metros where you could be at 3.9x or below. And now basically there are almost no metros at 3x or below. And even the 3.9 bar is pretty small. And you just see a very significant increase above 4x or even into 5x. It's really astounding just how many metros are above 5x in terms of this ratio. And so to me, it's very, very clear that over the past 25 years and even the past 5 years, we've seen a really significant increase in housing relative to the incomes that people are earning. So after looking at the data in that chart, I think it's hard to argue that there's not a problem here. And it probably comes as no surprise to you that 49% of renters and 24% of homeowners are now cost burdened by their housing. That means they're spending over 30% of their income on housing. So now that we've laid out the details of the crime, I'm going to get into the first suspect. So suspect number one is the global elite. I listened to this audiobook called The Wealth Hoarders, and the book goes into the mega wealthy. We're talking about people with hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of wealth and how they hide their wealth from taxation, and basically the entire industry built around this. And it talks about how a lot of times these folks will use shell companies to obscure who actually owns assets because there aren't a lot of good regulations around shell companies having to disclose the actual owner. And one of their favorite assets to purchase with these shell companies is real estate, because real estate tends to go up in value. You can buy a home or an apartment in some locations for millions and millions of dollars. So it's a good place to park a lot of your wealth. And then, hey, if you're in town and you need a place to stay, you've got a mega apartment, mansion, penthouse for yourself. So I wanted to look at how much we could actually track this down. To be honest, I couldn't find a lot of information about US mega wealthy and how much they own in terms of the housing stock, but I was able to get some pretty good data around foreign nationals. The National Association of Realtors put out data in 2025 that listed 78,000 home sales in the previous year from foreign nationals. And these foreign buyers paid in cash 47% of the time. That's compared to 28% for US buyers. It's pretty clear when you're bidding with all cash, you're easily going to be able to outbid someone who needs to take on a mortgage. A really vivid example of what happens when you have a lot of foreign buyers is South Florida. So at its peak in 2018, 50% of all home purchases in the Miami area were to foreign buyers. That has since come down to 10% as of 2024. And there's a few reasons for this. The mortgage rates are higher, the prices have gone through the roof, and also a lot of the immigration enforcement actions has made it a little bit more difficult as a non-US national. But I think there's another reason, at least in 2024, maybe not today, that the purchases from foreign nationals went down. In 2020, Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act, and this required shell companies to list the beneficial owner, basically the person that actually is getting the money out of the company, because a lot of times they'll have one person sign for literally tens of thousands of companies. And what I think is really interesting here is Marco Rubio was really pressing for this legislation because he was aware of just how many homes were being bought by foreign nationals, and a lot of them with dirty money. A lot of this is criminal activity that can be hidden through a shell company. It's obviously hard to say just how much, but if you were someone with a bunch of money and you wanted to hide it, putting it in a shell company and then dumping it into real estate wouldn't be a bad plan. So Marco Rubio really pressed for this. I don't think it's an accident that the percentage of home prices in South Florida from foreign nationals also fell during this time. Now, I would love to celebrate this as a great news story for us 99.99% people, but unfortunately, the Corporate Transparency Act has pretty much been completely gutted as of 2025. In 2025, FinCEN, which is basically the Financial Crimes Department of the US Treasury, put out a ruling that the Corporate Transparency Act would not apply to US nationals or US companies. And when you hear that, you sort of feel like, okay, that kind of makes sense, right? We just want to rid out the foreign bad guys, not all these Americans. Maybe that's not that bad of a decision. But then you look at the numbers, and that eliminates 99.9% of companies who were covered by the law. It literally goes from 32 million companies to about 12,000. And that's FinCEN's own estimate. That's not somebody else making this up. That is what they believe is going to happen. So this decision basically got the law for now, and we'll see where it goes from here. At this point, you may be thinking to yourself, Teresa, why should I care? I'm not buying a mega mansion, a penthouse apartment, so who cares if these global elite are coming in, US-based, foreign-based, clean money, dirty money, it doesn't matter, right? Well, I think there's two reasons you should care. The first is that most of these properties sit vacant for most of the year. So there's stories about entire floors of buildings in New York and other large cities just sitting empty. But we also have some data around this. As of 2024, 63% of all vacant properties were owned by investors. So we don't necessarily know if that's big corporate investors or these kind of shell companies, but I would say both probably contribute to that. And if I'm not going to be able to own a house, I'd like at least the existing houses to go to someone who will be in them. The other reason is it sort of does trickle down in an area. So let's say you live in a city where you might have some of these foreign investors buying the really high priced properties. And we know they might be paying all cash. So basically what happens is they are forcing out the existing wealthy, maybe people who could afford this really expensive property, but they need a mortgage. Where do you think those people go? Well, they go to the next neighborhood down, right? And they push out people who are in maybe the second tier neighborhood. And this kind of goes through and through a housing system where ultimately it is displacing people because these units are basically being taken off the market for someone who doesn't even live there. So I think it does matter. Now, do I think that I would say the global elite are guilty and they are the number one suspect of the crime of the criminally high-priced housing? No. We know that foreign nationals only make up about 2% of annual home purchases. So yes, this is a problem. I don't like it, but it isn't the primary driving factor behind the housing crisis. I will say, as we have a higher and higher concentration of wealth at the top, yes, I do expect the wealthy Americans to own more and more of the housing stock because they need to park their money somewhere and make a return. And housing is a pretty good target for that. But I'll dig into that in a future video. For this video, I would say, yes, they are probably guilty, maybe as an accessory or to a little lower degree, but I'm not going to stop with the ultra wealthy. I think there's a bigger problem here. And if I had to sum up US housing crime or the US housing problem in a single concept, it would be a lack of supply. Among comparable major countries, the US is one of the only countries where between 1995 and 2020, the housing stock grew more slowly than the population. This next section is going to go into who might be to blame for that. So that brings us to suspect number 2, the builders. Builders, developers, whatever you want to call them, they seem pretty guilty to me. Here's why. The US is facing a home shortage between 4 and 7 million homes. And I'm going to show you a graph that shows you why that is. Hint, it has something to do with the Great Recession. This line chart looks at the number of new housing units started each year from 1970 through to 2025. So what you can see is there's definitely variation over time. There's kind of peaks and valleys in this line all throughout, right? But consistently, you're seeing the number of new housing units between 1 million and let's say 2 million on the peaks, right? Pretty consistent there. And then you see again this big peak in 2005. And then the number of housing units really drops significantly. Obviously, this is all throughout the Great Recession. And in 2009, it drops to just over 500,000 housing units started. And I think the thing that's significant isn't just that it drops, but that it stays quite low. It was under 1 million units per year up until 2014. And then when we look at the overall shape of the graph here, it really hasn't recovered. It stayed below that 1.5 million. It did cross it here in 2021, 2022, but then it fell back again. And so when we look at the significant shortfall in US housing today, a lot of it, I think, has to do with this years and years long underbuilding spree after the Great Recession. And that has cumulatively gotten us to the point where we are 4 to 7 million homes short of what we need for Americans today. And in addition to not building enough, there's also a shift to more luxury and larger properties. I always laugh about this with my family back in Pennsylvania because I'll go home and we'll literally see these billboards advertising these houses and these luxury apartment buildings that are going up all over. Who could possibly afford to live in these places given the salaries that local jobs pay? We literally can't understand it. You don't see a lot of lower income or middle class housing going up. It really is a lot of these luxury apartments and houses. I'm going to show you a graph that actually talks you through and shows you the data between 2014 and 2024 to back up this claim. This chart shows us the number of rental units in millions across the side here, comparing price points across the spectrum, and it compares 2014 to 2024. The prices here have been adjusted for inflation, so we are comparing apples to apples, and that's not a part of the difference here. So what you can see is in 2014, we did have a meaningfully higher amount of apartments under $600 a month and a significantly higher amount of apartments in the $600 to $999 price points. And then over time, you can really see how it's shifted to a significantly higher percentage of apartments in this $1,400 to $1,999 bucket and over $2,000. So really a shift of apartments out of these kind of lower cost buckets and into these higher cost buckets. And this is just over the span of 10 years. So I think it's pretty significant that we're seeing such a shift. It's not just apartments that are shifting to more expensive options. It's also housing. So one thing that has really declined is the starter house. So these houses are typically defined as a house under 1,400 square feet. This feels really personal to me because I grew up in one of these homes. I grew up pretty low income. My mom was a single mom, and she was able to purchase an 850-ish square foot ranch house, not in the best school district, but it was a house. And it was in this whole development that was developed in the 1950s. We had a park down the street. It was a huge, huge win when my mom purchased that house. And unfortunately, houses like that just aren't being built today. Back in the 1970s, we were building about 400,000 starter homes under 1,400 square feet every year in the US. In 2020, we built 65,000. And that is despite the population obviously growing. So ideally that number would have actually been higher. Now I've laid out a lot of facts that make our builders and developers look pretty guilty of the crime of the high housing costs. But there's one fact that makes me say, maybe they aren't the ultimate bad guy here. And that is looking at the regulatory costs as part of constructing new buildings. So about 25% of the cost of a single family home and about 40% of the cost of a multifamily home goes to regulatory fees, environmental reviews, zoning, financing, all of that kind of stuff. Think about that. A quarter of the cost of a single family home and almost half of the cost of an apartment building is going to go to regulatory costs. So you can't blame the builders in some sense for wanting to build luxury apartments and bigger houses because they need to recoup their money. They're in it for the money. And so maybe we need to look at another suspect. So this brings us to suspect number 3, the government bureaucrats. So in order to investigate these government bureaucrats, I'm going to look right in my own backyard in the Bay Area. And the reason being that most of these people would tell you that they are really progressive and they want affordable housing to be constructed. But then you look at the laws and the regulations, and that doesn't really seem to add up. Actually, the first city with exclusionary zoning for single families was Berkeley in 1916. And while this wasn't explicitly part of the law, it was pretty clear to everyone involved that this was passed in order to keep non-white people and low-income people from encroaching on their beautiful city. And things have continued down the path of exclusionary zoning here. And really what exclusionary zoning or single-family zoning means is that you can't put up an apartment building or even a duplex. Anything that has multiple units within it is outlawed on the single-family zoned plots. And so that naturally is going to limit how much housing you can actually provide. So for example, as of 2020, 85% of Bay Area residential land was owned exclusively for single-family housing. Think about that. Only 15% of the residential land available could be used for duplexes, apartment buildings, anything other than a single-family home. That is wild. It is so unsurprising that we have a housing affordability crisis here when you think about these things, right? In San Francisco, 54% of the homes today could not be built under the current regulations. Literally, the regulations are so strict that half of all of the housing would not exist if it had to be built under the current regulations. And so it doesn't really seem like these rules and regulations are designed to increase the share of affordable housing. And the thing is, I don't think they are. I think that these politicians are responding to their constituents. And I think their constituents, while they would say that they are progressive, while they would say that affordable housing is important, they don't really want to see their property prices go down. Now, I will give San Francisco some credit. In 2026, they did pass some zoning reform. Unfortunately, they pretty much only did so because the state of California was forcing their hand and they had no other options. So I guess thanks, state of California, we got something. There's just not been much movement. And I think a lot of that is really because these government officials are responding to what the constituents want. So that brings us naturally to suspect number 4, the homeowners. So I'm going to keep this as factual as I possibly can and focus on 2 key reasons why I blame the homeowners, one of which is their fault, the other of which is actually an incentive problem, and I do not blame them for this. The one that is their fault is what is referred to as NIMBYism. So not in my backyard, that's what NIMBY stands for. And it's basically the idea that, let's say you are a homeowner in the Bay Area and you love to talk about your progressive policies and affordable housing, and you may be all for it until there's an apartment building that's going to be built down the block from you. And then all of a sudden, you're not that much of a fan because a lot of homeowners, their home is their biggest investment in their whole life. And a lot of homeowners see their home as an investment, which I don't have time in this video to debunk. I have my own thoughts about that. But people do think that. They do like to see the value of their property go up, even if it's only on paper. And so if something is going to be built that is going to threaten the value of their home, people are really driven to speak out against it. And the thing is, these city council meetings, these land use meetings, they're not super well attended. So even having a small group of homeowners show up and express their dissent or their disagreement with new developments being built can really influence things. And so a lot of the policies here, I think, are a reflection of the fact that people actually don't want more housing stock because the people who bought into the housing here are doing quite well, and they would prefer to keep the gains from their property, again, even if they're only on paper. But I do have a Bay Area success story for you. Berkeley, which I mentioned was the first city to implement exclusionary zoning, actually voted to end exclusionary zoning in 2021. And the reason why is really instructive. So actually what ended up happening is because Berkeley has a lot of students, they have a pretty well-known university, the students started organizing and going to land use meetings and expressing their desire to have more housing in the city and basically expressing support for local development projects. In addition, certain local groups rallied up non-students to go to city council and land use meetings and really put pressure on the city. And ultimately, they did vote to end exclusionary housing. So we can reverse the tide. The thing is, it is a little bit psychologically difficult to get non-homeowners excited and interested in going to these meetings. Because while homeowners see a real threat to their property value that they are currently tied to, if I'm a renter and I hear of a new apartment building, maybe I'll live there, maybe I won't. There's nothing explicitly tying me to that building in the same way that someone owns a home is tied to the value of that home. And also, homeowners are operating under loss aversion, which psychological studies have shown is a lot more powerful than the opportunity to gain. So even if I look at a potential development and say, hey, I could get a new apartment, somebody who is worried about losing the value of their home is going to be more motivated to attend these meetings. So I think a lot of it really has to do with organizing and getting people excited and motivated. And I think in Berkeley, it really did help that there were so many students who were looking for more affordable housing options. I told you I was going to list one item I do blame homeowners for and one item that I don't. Item number 2 is that homeowners just don't move enough. And I'll explain why I don't blame them for that. So I think there are lock-in effects that are causing people not to want to move. So in particular, right now, the interest rates on mortgages are a big reason why people don't want to leave their existing homes. A lot of people purchased during the pandemic at 3% rates or sometimes even lower than that. And the rates now are more like 7 to 8%. So even if you're going to purchase a home that costs less, you may be spending the same or even more in terms of your monthly cost. So I don't blame people for not wanting to move out of their house in a time where it doesn't make financial sense to do so. And in California, we have an additional layer of lock-in, and that is Proposition 13. California's Proposition 13, or Prop 13, was passed in 1978. And what it does is it caps the rate of increase on property taxes to 2% per year. Property taxes are reassessed whenever the property is actually sold. So if you own a home and the value of that home has been going up by more than 2% per year, you are effectively paying a reduced amount of property taxes. And as soon as you sell your home and buy something new, your property taxes are going to increase to the actual market rate of that new property. So even if you're downsizing, if you've been in a property for 20 years and the housing market has been crazy where you're located, you're potentially going to pay more in property taxes. So it really does incentivize people to stay in their homes. Don't take my word for it. A study actually looked at data comparing 1970 to 2000, so basically before and after Prop 13 was passed, and it found that in inland cities in California, the average tenure of a homeowner only went up less than 1 year, so not a big effect there. But in LA, it went up more than 2 years, and in the Bay Area, it went up 3 years. So that is actually meaningful that you have fewer homes available for sale and fewer people moving out of their existing homes, in part because of the incentive of having these artificially low property taxes. And that is exactly what Prop 13 does. So overall, where we have been so far, I would say that the super wealthy, they're more like an accessory. Builders, they're definitely not the core person to blame. Government regulators, they are not looking good. I think they're one of the core problems. And same thing with homeowners. Homeowners really are the pressure behind the government regulators. But wait, there are some other suspects we need to go through. These are the ones you've probably heard about in the media over and over again, and I'm going to lump 2 of them together. So let's look at suspects 5 and 6. corporate investors, and Airbnbs. So institutional investors and Airbnbs. I put them in the same category because I think they're both suffering from some pretty bad PR. The way I see them is these two are definitely hurting the situation and making a bad situation worse, but I sort of see them like the getaway driver. They're not really the mastermind. They're not the one most complicit in this crime. They're definitely guilty of something, but I think their role in the media is a little bit overblown, if I'm being honest. And look, I personally am not a fan of institutional investors. I would love nothing more than to tell you that they are the ultimate bad guys in this story. But this channel is not here for me to just spew my thoughts and feelings at you. I am trying to bring you facts and explain to you what the data actually says about these things. So institutional investors. Nationally, they purchase about 1.6% of homes, not very much. In some markets, this can be significantly more though, particularly in the Sun Belt. They've gained an interest. There are cities like Atlanta, Jacksonville, and Charlotte where you can see 4 to 5% of home purchases being done by these institutional investors like Blackstone. And when they are purchasing more of the housing stock, they can ultimately have more influence on the price. So a study found that in certain suburban Atlanta zip codes, institutional investors owned over 50% of the actively listed rental units. So if you own half of the supply, yeah, I do think that is a problem, and you can put real pressure on the prices. But nationally, I don't think institutional investors are really the largest cause in how we got to the state we're in today. We do have some data that in the most concentrated markets with institutional investors, their entry is responsible for about 20% of the increase in rents. So that's not nothing. 20% of the increase is meaningful, but that means 80% is coming from somewhere else, and this is only in the most concentrated markets. So nationally, less of an impact. In these certain Sunbelt markets where they have a higher share of the properties, more of an impact on the overall rents in the area. And that brings us to our last suspect, Airbnbs. A study looked at Airbnbs and they found for every 1% increase in Airbnb listings, rents increase by 0.018%. So that sounds pretty abysmal. However, the median increase in Airbnb listings in this study was 28%. So that sort of adds up. And the researchers in this study out of USC estimated that Airbnb probably contributes around 1/5 of the average annual increase in rent in the US and about 1/7 of the average annual increase in home prices. So not nothing, definitely a meaningful amount, but not the predominant driver. And the researchers even said it themselves. They said that Airbnb isn't the cause of the housing crisis, but it's definitely exacerbating a bad situation already. Another study out of McGill found that looking at Airbnb properties in New York City, they probably contributed to a rent increase of 1.4% per year, or about $380 annually. So meaningful, but again, I don't think we're $380 annually off of where we need to be in terms of housing costs. So I would find Airbnb and institutional investors guilty, but more so as an accessory than the main reason for our crime of criminally high housing costs. But not to end the episode on a down note, there are some areas where I see some hope, some progress when it comes to housing affordability. So for example, in terms of relaxing regulations, I think a really good example is the city of Houston. In 2023, the Houston metro area approved 70,000 housing permits. Compare that to New York City, that metro has about 3 times the number of people living there, and they only approved 40,000. So almost half for 3 times the population. And that's in part because Houston has really reduced zoning regulations, and you see the proof in the actual housing that they are able to authorize and build. And so that's definitely a positive sign. You also have certain municipalities deciding to end single-family zoning. Minneapolis was the first major city to do this in 2018. Washington State, as a state, outlawed single-family zoning in 2023. So I think that's really a point of progress as well. And I think we will see more localities passing similar laws in the future. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention New York City and what Mayor Zoran Mamdani is doing. For example, he got passed a pied à terre tax, which is going to tax second or third or fourth homes or investment properties of $1 million or more in value that are not someone's primary residence. And the tax will range from 4 to 6.5%, and it's expected to generate $500 million in revenue for the city. I personally love this design. I think that having ultra wealthy people, especially in these large cities, purchase properties that are just sitting empty is a real problem. And at least the city can get some tax revenue that they can do some good work with and also make it less attractive for the mega rich to purchase these properties. So I'm definitely a fan of that. He also recently got passed a rent freeze on about 1 million rent stabilized apartments in New York City. I don't love rent control as a policy, but at the state that we're in today, I will kind of take anything that will help people be able to afford their housing. So even though economically I have some issues with that, I would call this a small win as well. In the case of the criminally high housing, I think we really have 6 guilty parties. So let's go over what we've uncovered. We've got the uber wealthy and the global elite for purchasing housing that they are not even occupying and parking their money using these shell companies in properties, which is driving up the prices and removing units that we desperately need from the market. There's also the builders and developers for not building enough after the Great Recession, leading to the shortage we find ourselves in today, and for building too many luxury apartments and large houses. Come on, bring back these starter homes. We also found our government bureaucrats guilty for all the red tape, the exclusionary zoning, the environmental regulations, and for caving to the pressure of these NIMBY homeowners. And there's the NIMBY homeowners themselves for pressuring the regulators and for doing whatever they can to prevent more housing from being built. Come on, you guys, please help us. And then lastly, we have our institutional investors and Airbnbs, the getaway drivers to it all, making a bad situation worse, but not the primary reason we're in this situation today. In my next video, I'm going to examine a really interesting recent development around housing. We actually just had the biggest piece of housing legislation become law in the last 30 years. So the question is, has Congress done enough? Is this going to fix housing? Tune in to my next video to find out all about it. I'm Teresa, and I studied economics, so you don't have to.